Welcome back. We're going to start again. And this afternoon will be dedicated to the foundations of number, space, and time interactions in animals. We will see that it is possible to build animal models of number processing and its relation to time and space. And I'm happy to call first one of the persons who has contributed a lot in ethology towards understanding of number, space, and time in animals. Giorgio Vallortigara will tell us about space and number in animals. Giorgio.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you very much to Professor Dehaene for this kind invitation, and thank you very much to the Collège de France for organizing this beautiful meeting. Studies on the ontogenetic origins of human knowledge provide evidence for a small set of separable core knowledge mechanisms dealing with object, number, space, geometry, and so on. And given that because these core knowledge mechanisms are likely to be evolutionarily ancient, it could be useful to investigate them from a comparative point of view and using animal model systems. And in this talk, I would like to stress the role and the advantages provided by some animal model systems. And I would like to stress in particular that traditionally the use of animal model system in neurosciences is associated with the idea of replacement of humans in all those experiments that for ethical, practical reason cannot be carried out in humans, like invasive procedure. But this is a very restricted view of comparative approach, because in fact, animal models are not selected because they are replacement of humans in experiment. They are selected because of certain specific advantages they could provide an advance, or they may allow addressing specific problems, irrespective of whether the methods used is behavioral, neurobiological, or so on. So what are the main advantages of comparative studies? Well, one advantage is obviously that animal models are used for testing the generality of core knowledge systems in different species, and in particular, to establish what aspects of cognition would be uniquely human. So in a sense, they could provide a proof of existence or not existence for computational abilities which are available irrespective of possession of language or higher symbolic activities. Then, they are useful for testing to what extent core knowledge systems are available at birth or are shaped by experience. This would be the main focus of my talk. And third, animal models obviously would allow a direct attack to the problem of the underlying neural and genetic mechanisms of core knowledge systems. So let's start first with the second issue. I am well aware that the nature-nurture issue is quite old-fashioned. We all know as biologists that the road from genes to behavior is a complex one and always involves the intertwining of genetic, epigenetic, and experiential factors. But the point that I would like to stress is that the problem of the origin of information that an animal, an organism might appear to possess is a different problem from the problem of the development of behavior. In principle, I think that if we specify exactly what condition of empirical experience may affect or might not affect a particular piece of knowledge, this could be empirically addressable. So let's consider an example, which is not from number and space to start, but from something very basic, namely physics, and in particular, object mechanics. So let's consider this very simple experiment we perform with young chicks using the imprinting phenomenon. You are familiar with imprinting. I imagine it is the learning process by which the young of some animals, usually of precocial species, learn to recognize their mother or their siblings, their social partner, by simply being exposed to them for a very short period soon after hatching. So let's imagine that soon after hatching, chicks, a group of chicks is imprinted on a simple red cylindrical object for a very short period of time. And then chicks are confined into a transparent partition, and they could observe the mother moving and disappearing behind either one of two identical opaque screens, tilted 45 degrees. And this is repeated several times in such a way to accustom the animal to the procedure. And then there is the test. The mother is moving straight forward towards the screen, and then an opaque partition is placed in front of the chick in such a way that they cannot observe. And the mother is made to disappear, and the slant of the two screens is changed, and it is changed in such a way that there is space, room enough behind one of the screens for the mother to be there, but not beneath the other screen. And the problem is whether the chick is able to take into account, in the memory, the shape and the size of the object and the principle of the solidity with respect to the slanting, which is perceived as an occlusion event. And what we found is indeed that chicks, when they have to choose, they choose the highest screen. Well, maybe they are simply showing a preference for the highest screen with respect to the horizontal position, but let's consider a very simple control experiment. This time the procedure is similar, but the mother is smaller. So, for instance, the mother is moving again towards one or other of the two screens, and then after disappearance of the mother, the slant is changed. But given that the mother is smaller, this time there is space, there is room enough, even beneath the other screen. So if chicks have a preference for the highest one, they would express a similar preference. But what happens is that in this case, they did not show any preference. This is a general paradigm of an example of a more general series of experiments we perform. I show you some other example, and the idea is always the same. The chick is imprinted on an object, and it is showing following behavior to the object. And different groups of chicks are reared with different types of mother. For instance, a slim mother, a large mother, and so on. And then they are tested with screens which have different occluding property, different slant, different size, different width, and so on. For instance, a slim mother is moving, and then the chick is presented with two screens of different height. So you can see that in this case, the mother cannot be here because it would be visible according to the usual occluding principle in the world. It should be there. Or in another condition, this is a large mother, and then there are two screens with different size. And again, there is one screen that should be correct according to very basic occluding and physical properties of the world. These are the results of some experiment. For instance, chicks reared with balls of different age and then tested in the condition with the screen of a different age. They show a preference when the ball is high, but not when it is small. Or again, when they are reared with an object of different size and tested with screen of different width, they show a preference when they are reared with the largest object, but not with the smaller one. So the point I would like to stress here is, what is the origin of this knowledge very, very young chicks, a few hours after hatching, seems to possess? Of course, you can argue for an empiricist explanation, but the point, in my view, is that any empiricist explanation should be specific concerning the properties which are assumed to be underlying the ability of the animals. Because you cannot argue that animals are simply interacting with objects in the natural world. This is true, but there are several types of different objects in the world. There are solid objects, there are liquid objects, there are soft objects, for instance, conspecifics, there are shadows, and so on. So in this specific case, all the experience of chicks is simply to be reared with an imprinting object. So maybe the crucial aspect is the fact that the chicks have the possibility to interact, to peck, to touch, and to play with the object. But this can be addressed experimentally. So, for instance, if chicks are reared in this sort of condition in which there is a partition, they cannot touch the object, they cannot peck the object, and they cannot see any sort of visual interaction between different types of objects, solid or not. What would be the result? Well, the result is exactly the same as in the first case. So this sort of experience is not needed in order to show this basic property of mechanics of physical objects. I think that a similar line of reasoning or a similar strategy of research may be applied to other domains like number and space. Consider first number. These are some experiments we performed with Rosa Rugani and Lucia Regolin. They are very similar to the previous one. Chicks are reared this time with a group of imprinting objects, 5 overall, and at test they are presented with a series of objects moving either as a group or one after the other behind either one of 2 screens. So, for instance, there is 1, 2, 3 objects disappearing behind this screen on the left, and 1, 2 objects disappearing behind this screen. At this point, there are 3 here and 2 here. And there are good reasons from an ethological point of view because chicks would prefer the largest number of companions, both for protection against predation and also for heat dissipation, which is very important for very young chicks. And what we found is that they choose the correct screen, irrespective of whether the movement is successive or simultaneous of the overall group or of the single imprinting object, one after the other. Could be that they are taking into account the overall amount of stuff, not just number, but the continuous physical variable that co-vary with number. So we turn to the use of 2-dimensional stimuli and make equal in the 2 conditions contour length and area, and you can see that the result is very much the same. Similarly, chicks can be shown to be able to perform some very simple, primitive form of addition and subtraction. This is shown here. Again, one object is moving and disappearing behind the screen on the right, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 in sequence, objects are hidden behind the screen on the left. And then, after that, there is the moving visibly in this region of 1, 2 objects which are subtracted to this group. So overall, there should be 3 objects here and 2 objects here. Of course, this is the screen behind which the last object moving has been seen. So it may be it is in the short-term memory of the animal. Again, we can check for this. If I subtract just 1 object, this again is the screen behind which the last object has been seen to move, but the largest number this time is on the left. And again, chicks are able to solve the task with both conditions of subtraction 1 or 2. I would like to show you an example. This is for media, so it does not reproduce exactly the lighting condition of the experiment, but provide you with a rough idea of the experiment. There is one social partner moving and disappearing behind the screen to the right side, another one. Three. Four. Then one on the other side. And finally, a subtraction, one of the objects to the right moved to the left. So in this particular case, the last moving object has been to this side. Then the chick is allowed to choose, ponder a little bit. Okay, Consider that this particular turning of the eye, I mentioned this, is not related to lack of attention. Birds have two foveal systems and the frontal and the lateral field of vision. So when they are looking at objects at a distance, they typically look in this way. You know that probably looking at the pigeons in the public places. One puzzling aspect of these results is that the overall number involved in this sort of ability is quite high, 5 overall. And we know from other research, in particular with human infants, that when human infants have to discriminate between quantities which are within the different system, the small numerosity and the large numerosity system, like 1 versus 4, 1 versus 5, and so on, they have difficulty. And this difficulty seems to be not apparent in chicks. So my first guess was that was probably related to a system which was specialized to the number of flocks of individuals, so to social aspects. And so we checked for that with a variety of experiments using both imprinting objects, mealworm, that is food objects, completely unrelated to social aspects, and two-dimensional imprinting objects to control for continuous physical variable. And to make short a long story, what we found is that they are able to discriminate. 1 versus 4, 1 versus 5, 2 versus 4, 2 versus 4 with control of continuous physical variable. There is a reduction, which means that they are taking into account things like surface, overall surface, and probably contour length. But again, this is still significant and quite consistent in different groups of animals. Before turning to space, I would like to mention briefly one serendipitous finding that occurred when we were investigating the ability of chicks to deal with the serial ordering and the ordinal properties of number. And this was in origin a control to check whether they were really using number and not space. The experiment is very simple. It has been duplicated then by Debbie Kelly, a Canadian colleague, with Clark nutcrackers, which are corvids. And the experiment is of this sort. Chicks or Clark nutcrackers are trained to discriminate, to choose in a series of jars, organized food containers in a sagittal ordering, the fourth one. And then the overall line is rigidly rotated and is placed in a horizontal position. So at this point, the fourth position could be considered from the left or from the right side, and we didn't expect, in fact, any bias, but what we found, much to our surprise, is that both bird species show a striking left side bias. This is an example of a phenomenon which is associated with the peculiarities of a particular animal model system, because what is the reason why chicks and Clark nutcracker show this sort of evidence? Well, the reason is mainly anatomical. These are the visual pathway of chicks, or in general avian species, apart from particular cases like owls that have frontal eyes. And there are two pathways: the thalamofugal pathway, which is homologous to the reticulo-geniculo-striatal pathway, and the tectofugal pathway, which is homologous to the collicular extrastriate pathway of mammals. And there is complete crossover at the optic chiasma, so fibers ascend prevalently contralaterally. There is some crossover in the thalamofugal pathway and also at the optic tectum level, but it is quite minor, and in particular, birds lack the large bundle of fibers of the corpus callosum connecting homologous region at the telencephalic level. So if this is correct, probably we can reveal more strikingly the asymmetry by simply temporarily occluding one eye, because in birds, most of the information entering each eye is processed, at least initially, in the contralateral side of the brain. So when we tested chicks in this condition, and there is the poster of Rosa Rugani in the hall, if you are more interested in the details, is basically this. When they are using their left eye, they show a bias to the left. And when they were using the right eye, they show a bias to the right. And the bias in the binocular condition was exactly the same, or mostly the same, as the bias in the left eye condition. That's striking, because it means that in the binocular condition, they are in some way not using information from both hemispheres, but there is one hemisphere, one side of the brain, which takes charge of control of behavior, and that decide to allocate attention to the left hemispace. With the right eye, they do exactly the opposite. The second issue is what the origin of the asymmetry is related to space or is related to number. Consider that in this case there is a rigid rotation of the pattern, so inter-element distances were exactly the same. What happens if we change the inter-element distances at training and at test? What we found is that they were very good in selecting the fourth, the correct position, but in this case there was no bias at all. Now, come back to the condition in which they are trained with fixed inter-element distances during training. That is, do they encode number, serial positioning, or only spatial aspects, distances? Well, we know very well that they encode both, because if they are trained, say, to learn the fourth position, and then the distances are changed in such a way that the fourth correct jar is now to a distance which is completely different, they search correctly for the serial number, not for the distance. So they encode during training the ordinal position of the correct food container. But if you change the inter-element distances at test, so you provide a difference between the training condition and the testing condition, they search correctly, so they use the serial positioning, the ordinal positioning, but there is no any bias at all. So my idea is that what is happening here is that chicks during training with fixed inter-elements interval form two types of representation. One representation concerns the pure numerical aspect, ordinal, serial order. So the correct jar is the fourth one, that is the one coming after the third and before the fifth, without any encoding of the distances, like, you know, the ordinal scales in the theory of measurement. And another representation concerns the spatial aspects, which is also formed and take into account distances between elements, distances between the end and the position of the correct. So if at test they found the same positioning, the same distance, there is a sort of extra activation of the right hemisphere that is lateralized and direct attention to the left hemispace. But if there is a change, there is only the numerical representation, which seems to be bilateral. So they go to the correct number, but without any bias. So this is a nice story, I think. I hope it is also correct. A further evidence is provided by the fact that if you change something else, for instance, the color rather than the space, the bias is still there. So it is not a response to the novelty, for instance. Now let's turn to space. Again, you are very familiar, I imagine, with this task, which has been largely investigated by developmental psychologists. It is a rectangular room in which it is possible to disentangle between the different corners using very simple geometric properties. Metric properties in the arrangement of surfaces as surfaces, length wall, short wall, and long wall, and what is called in geometry sense, that is the distinction between right and left. Here is an example. This is Sangha, Dr. Sangha working in the laboratory of Liz Pelkey. She is now in my lab, showing an example with young children. There is a toy in a corner, and then the children is blindfolded and disoriented spatially, turning him several times. You will see here the choice based on geometrical aspects. The children is first looking to this corner, which is not correct, and then immediately to the opposite one. Both these corners are identical geometrically, that is, there is a short wall on the right and a long wall on the left, and they are different from the other two. So again, what happens if with very, very young chicks we rear the animals in different environments, providing presumably different geometric information? So again, chicks soon after hatching are placed for a very short period of time together with the imprinting object in this environment, and then they are tested in a working memory task like this one. There is the imprinting ball, and the imprinting ball is moving behind one of the panels located at the corner. Then the chick is spatially disoriented by turning it several times, and then he has the possibility to make a choice. And again, after the first trial, the position of the imprinting object is changed from trial to trial. This is a very difficult task, more difficult than the typical one used with children, because the same corner is selected in children experiment. In this case, different corners are used. But chicks manage the task, and they seem to be completely unaffected by the previous rearing conditions. Now turn to a completely different species. This is a version of the geometric task for bumblebee. No bumblebee, they are very similar to honeybees, and they are Hymenoptera, and they are interesting for this reason. The task is very similar. There is a rectangular room, and there are L-shaped aperture here, allowing the bumblebee to exit from the environment. And at the corner, these times, there are different types of panels providing featural information. So the task is something like this one, similar to the one tested with chicks and with children and with pigeons and a variety of other creatures. This is the bumblebee here, and this is the correct corner. And you can see it is exiting. Very good. So the experiment is of this sort. Bumblebees are trained with the overall arrangement of panels, and then after training, so consider this is the correct panel, there is no any need to encode geometric information because featural information provides all the information for the correct corner. What happens when all panels are removed? You can see that bumblebees did not go back to random choices, but they search. These are mean choice with confidence interval. You see that they search in the two geometrically correct locations. There is no way, obviously, to recognize corner A from corner C, but they can distinguish corner AC from corner BD, which are certainly incorrect. On the other hand, they seem to use panels at the corner as beacon, not as real landmarks, because if I remove only the two panels in the geometrically correct location, there is enough information in principle to distinguish between corner A and corner C using the residual information available at B and D. It would be enough to remember that close to the correct corner on the right there is this green cross. But they seem to be unable to do that, and they search at random between A and C. This difference is not significant, as you can see. And finally, if you perform an affine transformation, which is a typical transformation in geometry, that is turning the positioning of the panels by one step in this way, this panel is moved here, and this is moved here, and so on. So you can see that the featurally correct panel is now in a novel position, which is geometrically incorrect. And bumblebees search close to the panel without making any geometric errors. That's very surprising, but it is exactly the same pattern of results which has been observed in children, in chicks, in pigeons, and in monkeys, for all visual creatures. So why it is interesting to investigate bumblebees in this task? Well, the reason is that for insects, there is a prominent theory concerning the way in which they could orient and navigate in space, which is based on the idea that they simply use a view matching procedure. That is, they take a sort of snapshot based on the two-dimensional distribution of a scene, and then they move in the environment, minimizing the current view with the stored representation. This is a very elegant way to explain results like this of the geometric module. So it is interesting to compare, for instance, conditions in which three-dimensional surface layout are providing or image matching mechanism, for instance, in chicks. This is the work we did with Sangali, Spelky. There's one condition in which small borders, 2 centimeters in height, are available, or small sort of hills is visible here, providing, again, variation in the surface layout in the terrain, or purely two-dimensional form, like a floor of a different color, or, that's interesting, object array, that is, columns. And the results show that chicks are able to reorient when using three-dimensional spatial layout information, but not using two-dimensional ones or columns. It would be interesting to see, we haven't yet the data, whether invertebrates behave in a different way in this task, because it could be that the same behavioral solution is obtained by completely different mechanisms. In conclusion, I would like to mention another example of the type of investigation that can be done concerning the computational abilities of animals to deal with geometry, using in this case zebrafish. We trained zebrafish in a variant of the classical experiment with the geometric modules, in which animals were placed in the center. They can see a conspecific in a corner, then they were rotated, the conspecific was removed, and then they have to search for one or other of the screen. And we tested in this case whether they were orienting using distance or length information. This is shown here. This is classical rectangular room with extended surfaces. This is a condition in which the walls have exactly the same length, but the distance is different. And this is the reverse. Here, the walls have different length, but the distance is exactly the same. This is a further condition similar to the columns. And you can see that zebrafish are using only distance, but they are not using length. So it is possible to disentangle what specific aspects animals are using in this sort of geometric task. I mentioned zebrafish for good reason. Obviously, they are an excellent model for investigation of the biological mechanism, and we know that there are orthologs of some genes in zebrafish which seems to be involved in Williams syndromes. Recently, Barbara Landau has shown that people with Williams syndrome have a specific difficulty with the geometric module task. They are good at reorienting if there are features in the environment, but they are completely at random when they are tested in the purely geometric task. That's very interesting, and we haven't yet the orthologs for the zebrafish, but we started with some work with mice. I would like to mention just this butt-face mutant. This is a new model showing a point mutation in the beta-catenin gene, and this is a protein associated with intracellular signal transducers. And these mice have a variety of problems, in particular with respect to synaptic plasticity. There is a deficit in long-term potentiation in the hippocampus. When tested in our geometric task, they seem to have a specific deficit, the bat phase, with respect to the wild types animals. Okay, just to summarize, just the day before leaving to Paris, Yves Christin alerted me that he is going to publish a book here in France next week. And I haven't seen the book. I'm sure it's very nice. But I asked Yves the permission to use the cover because it's very nice and it conveys the sort of message of my talk. That is the idea of a poussin kantien, a Kantian chick. Namely, the idea that there is a lot of knowledge which is built in, available to very young creatures, vertebrates, maybe also invertebrates, before that any shaping by experience has been exerted on this knowledge. Thank you very much for your attention.